The night Dana Graves received 7 target designations, she read them twice, folded the paper, and put it in the breast pocket of her uniform directly over her heart. Not for sentiment, for accessibility. She wanted those names and grid coordinates close to her body, somewhere she could reach them without looking, the way you keep the things that matter most in the places you can find them in the dark. She was 31 years old, a staff sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment's Special Operations Sniper Program, and she had been doing this work for 8 years with a consistency and a precision that had generated a file in the Pentagon thick enough to use as a doorstop. Her confirmed kill count was classified above the level most people in her chain of command were cleared to access. Her nickname among the SEALs and Rangers and Delta operators who'd worked alongside her across 3 deployments was a word in Pashto that translated roughly as the woman the mountain sends, and that she had never used herself because she found it excessive, though she understood why people reached for that kind of language when they were trying to describe something that resisted ordinary description. What she was, stripped of the mythology, was a woman who had spent 8 years learning one thing with absolute devotion: how to be somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, do something that seemed impossible, and leave without anyone knowing she'd been there. Tonight that skill was going to be tested, in a way it had never been tested before. The briefing had happened 6 hours earlier in a plywood room at FOB Asadabad, with Captain Hollister running the presentation and the particular overhead lighting that made everyone in the room look like they hadn't slept in a week, which in most cases was accurate. Dana had sat in the back row with her notebook open and her pen moving and her face giving away nothing, which was her standard configuration for receiving information she was still processing. The situation was this. A SEAL team, 8 operators from Team 7, call sign Rampart, had inserted into the Kunar Valley 18 hours ago to capture or kill a Taliban logistics commander named Farouk Nasir, whose supply network had been directly responsible for 14 American casualties over the previous 4 months. The intelligence on Nasir's location was solid, the insertion had gone cleanly, and Rampart had reached their objective building without contact. Then everything had gone wrong in the specific, comprehensive way that things in the Kunar Valley had a talent for going wrong. Enemy forces had identified the SEAL team's presence. How exactly was still being assessed, but the working theory was a compromised local source, and had responded by moving 7 highly skilled snipers into elevated positions surrounding Rampart's location. Not ordinary fighters. Trained marksmen, several of whom had likely received formal sniper instruction from sources that intelligence suggested included former Soviet bloc military advisors. They had established overlapping fields of fire that covered every exit route from the objective building. Rampart was trapped inside with their HVT secured and alive, which was the good news, and with no viable extraction route, which was the bad news, and with 7 enemy snipers in prepared positions who had already demonstrated their capability by wounding 2 of Rampart's 8 operators in the first exchange of fire. The SEAL team leader, a lieutenant commander named Prescott, whose voice on the radio had the specific quality of someone managing a crisis, with everything they had while trying not to sound like that was what they were doing, had transmitted 3 words that had become the operational summary of the entire situation. Too many snipers. That was the problem. Rampart couldn't move without exposing themselves to fire from multiple angles simultaneously. Air support had been requested, but the valley's topography and the proximity of the snipers to civilian structures made precision airstrikes a legal and tactical nightmare that would take hours to resolve through the chain of command. A ground QRF could reach the valley in approximately 90 minutes, but 90 minutes in a building surrounded by 7 trained marksmen, with 2 wounded operators and ammunition running down, was a calculation that didn't resolve in Rampart's favor. Someone needed to remove the snipers, quietly, sequentially, without alerting the remaining targets as each one was eliminated. Captain Hollister had looked at Dana When he reached this part of the briefing, she had already been doing the math. 7 targets. Prepared positions, meaning elevated, meaning they had good sightlines and cover. Overlapping fields of fire, meaning she couldn't engage one without potentially being observed by another. In the dark, which was an advantage for her and a disadvantage for them if she was careful about her signature. Working alone, because adding a spotter added movement and movement added risk, and the entire operation depended on the kind of silence that only one person moving very carefully could produce. She had asked 4 questions. What were the confirmed positions of all 7 targets? What was the timeline before Rampart's situation became critical? What were the rules of engagement regarding civilian structures? And what was her extraction protocol if the situation deteriorated? Hollister had answered all 4 directly and completely, which she appreciated. The positions were confirmed by drone imagery taken 40 minutes before the briefing. The timeline was assessed at 3 hours before Rampart's situation became untenable. Civilian structures were off limits for direct fire, but she could engage from them if necessary. Extraction was her own responsibility. She would insert alone, work alone, and extract to a pickup point 2 kilometers east of the objective, where a vehicle would wait for 6 hours. She had nodded and closed her notebook, and said she needed 2 hours to prepare. Hollister had said she had 90 minutes. She had taken 87. She inserted by rope from a helicopter that never landed, dropping into a dry streambed 800 meters south of the objective building, while the helicopter continued north, as if conducting a routine patrol, its sound fading into the mountain darkness without pause or variation. The whole thing took 11 seconds from rope deployment to her feet on the ground. She was moving north before the helicopter was out of auditory range. Her rifle was a Mk-21 PSR, with a suppressor that she had personally fitted and tested, until the sound signature was as close to nothing as physics allowed. In the Kunar Valley at night, with wind moving through the rocky terrain and the ambient noise of a valley that was never entirely silent, the suppressed report of her weapon at the distances she'd be working, 400 to 800 meters, would be, to anyone not directly beside her, indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the environment. A rock shifting, a bird startled from a roost, something that registered below the threshold of alarm. That was the theory. The practice would depend on execution, and execution depended on patience. And patience was the thing Dana Graves had in quantities that consistently surprised the people who worked with her, who were themselves not patient people by ordinary civilian standards. She reached her first observation position at 22:47 hours, settling into a depression in the rocky ground that gave her sightlines to 3 of the 7 confirmed sniper positions. She spent 18 minutes doing nothing but watching, her body completely still, her breathing controlled, her eyes moving through the scope in a slow, methodical pattern that covered every position and the terrain between them. She was building the picture, not just where the targets were, but how they were positioned, how they moved, what their patterns were, how frequently they shifted, whether they were communicating with each other, and by what means. This information was more important than the shot itself, because the shot was the easy part. The shot was mechanics and physics and muscle memory. The part that required actual intelligence was understanding the system she was about to reach into and remove elements from without the system detecting what was happening, until it was too late to respond. What she saw over those 18 minutes told her several things. The snipers were professional. They moved infrequently and minimally, the way trained marksmen learn to move, small adjustments, weight shifts, the occasional repositioning of a limb that had gone numb. They were not the kind of untrained fighters who fidgeted and smoked and talked and revealed themselves constantly. These were men who understood stillness. They were also, all 7 of them, focused on the objective building. This was their tactical purpose, to keep Rampart pinned, and they were executing it with discipline, which meant that their attention was oriented away from the terrain behind them, away from the approaches that Dana was using, away from the woman lying in a depression in the rocky ground 800 meters south, watching them through a scope and making decisions about the order in which they would die. She identified her sequence in the first 12 minutes of observation. The two most dangerous targets first, the ones whose positions gave them the widest fields of observation, whose elimination would reduce the risk to her own position most significantly. Then the three mid-range targets, working east to west because the wind was moving east to west tonight, and a westward moving wind would carry sound away from the remaining targets rather than toward them. Then the final two, who were positioned closest to the objective building, and whose elimination would open the extraction routes that Rampart needed. The sequence was not complicated, the execution would be. She settled behind her rifle and began. The first target was at 640 meters, positioned on a rocky outcropping that gave him excellent observation of the objective building's northern face. He was lying prone as she was, his own rifle pointing north. She watched him for 4 minutes before she fired, establishing his breathing pattern, his micro-movements, the small rhythms of his stillness. Then she put the crosshairs on the base of his skull, the shot that was both the most certain and the most humane, that turned off everything in an instant without struggle or sound. And she fired during the pause between his exhale and his next inhale, when his body was at its most still. The suppressed crack was swallowed by the wind. The target's body settled. No dramatic motion, no cry, no alert. He simply became more still than he had been, which was the only visible difference between alive and dead at 600 meters in the dark. She watched the other 6 positions for 3 full minutes before moving. This was the discipline that separated what she did from simply shooting, the patience to wait, to watch, to confirm that the system had not registered the disruption before she introduced another one. 3 minutes felt like nothing in a normal context. In this context, with Rampart's timeline ticking and 2 wounded operators inside that building, 3 minutes felt like holding her breath underwater. Nothing moved, no heads turned, no positions adjusted in the pattern that would indicate alarm. She moved to her second observation point. The second target was the most dangerous of the 7, a man who had positioned himself in a way that suggested formal training, who had chosen his ground with a sophistication that Dana recognized as the work of someone who had been taught by someone good. He was at 720 meters, tucked into a fold in the terrain that made him nearly invisible from the ground, but exposed to the elevated angle Dana was now working from. She had identified his position in the first minutes of observation, not by seeing him directly, but by reading the ground, by identifying the position she would have chosen in his situation, and then looking at that position more carefully until the man inside it resolved from the background. She spent 7 minutes on this target, not because the shot was technically more difficult, though the angle was demanding and required careful adjustment to her elevation dial, and a precise calculation of the wind deflection at this range. She spent 7 minutes because this man's field of observation overlapped with her current position in a way that required her to understand exactly where his attention was directed before she exposed herself to take the shot. One wrong assumption, and she became the target. She watched. She read his pattern. She identified the 3-second window every 90 seconds when his scope traversal took his observation away from her quadrant. She fired in one of those windows. 2 down, 5 remaining. The building where 8 SEALs were waiting held on. She moved. The next 4 hours were the most concentrated work of Dana Graves's professional life. Not the most dangerous, necessarily. She had been in situations with more immediate physical peril, more direct threat, more rounds coming her way. But this was the work that demanded everything simultaneously. The physical discipline of sustained stillness and controlled movement, the mental precision of continuous ballistic calculation and wind reading and range estimation, the tactical intelligence of managing a complex multi-target environment, where each action changed the conditions for every subsequent action. And underneath all of it, the patience that was not passive but active, not waiting but watching, not stillness for its own sake, but stillness in service of understanding. The third target died at 23:41 hours, at a range of 490 meters. He had shifted position twice since her initial observation, which meant her original range card was wrong, and she had to recalculate from current data. She did this without rushing, without allowing Rampart's situation to create the kind of urgency that led to errors, because an error in this environment didn't mean a missed shot. It meant a missed shot followed by a living, alerted sniper who now knew she was there, which meant all 6 remaining targets knew within 30 seconds, which meant Rampart was worse off than before she'd arrived. She did not miss. The fourth target presented a problem. He was positioned in a structure, a partially collapsed building that provided both cover and concealment, with a firing port that gave him observation of the objective's eastern face while protecting him from direct observation. Dana could see his muzzle barely, and could see the occasional shift of a shadow within the firing port, but she could not get a clear line to him from any of her planned positions. She spent 22 minutes solving this problem, not by repositioning aggressively, not by accepting a marginal shot, but by thinking through the geometry of his position and her available angles until she identified a single point in the terrain, a small rise 200 meters northeast of her current position, that would give her a 13-degree elevation advantage and a sightline through the upper portion of his firing port. Reaching that point required crossing 80 meters of open ground between her current position and the rise. Open ground in a valley with 3 active snipers remaining, in the dark, with no cover. She crossed it in a low crawl that took 11 minutes and produced the kind of sustained physical discomfort that she had long since learned to process as information rather than sensation. Her body telling her things about the terrain and her own state that she filed and used and did not dwell on. From the rise, the shot was there. The firing port's upper edge gave her a corridor approximately 14 inches wide and 8 inches tall, at 530 meters, through which she could see the silhouette of a head and partial upper body. It was not a certain shot. It was the best available shot, and it was available for a window of time she estimated at 30 seconds before the angle closed as the target shifted. She fired. The shadow in the firing port became still. 4 down, 3 remaining. At 34 hours, she radioed Rampart on the frequency she'd been given. 1 transmission, short. No authentication code because the authentication code was 3 words and she wanted to use 2. 4 clear, she said. Lieutenant Commander Prescott's voice came back immediately, tight and controlled as it had been in the recording she'd heard during the briefing. Copy 4. 3 remain, northeast, east, and southeast of your position. Northeast is most active. She already knew this, but she acknowledged the information because Prescott had people in that building who were watching through their own scopes, and their information had value. Copy, she said. Maintain position. She moved northeast. The 5th target was the one that nearly ended the mission. Not because he was technically the most difficult shot. He wasn't. But because at 51 hours, as Dana was establishing her firing position at approximately 550 meters from his location, he moved. Not a small adjustment, not a weight shift, but a full repositioning, picking up his rifle and moving 30 meters north along the ridgeline to a new position that took him out of her planned angle and put him, temporarily, in a location where he had observation of the approach route she just used. She went completely still. He had not seen her. She was certain of this because if he had seen her, the response would have been immediate and loud, and the entire operational picture would have changed in ways she was not prepared to manage. He had moved for his own reasons, discomfort, perhaps, or a tactical decision about his sightlines, or simply the instinct of a trained man who knew that staying in one position too long was its own kind of vulnerability. She waited 12 minutes, completely motionless, her body merged with the rocky ground, her breathing reduced to the minimum her physiology required, her mind running through the recalculation of range and angle for his new position, while her body did the work of being invisible. At the 12-minute mark, he settled. She had his new position, new range, 580 meters, new angle, new wind calculation. She had studied him long enough in his new position to read his pattern. She fired at 1:08 hours. 5 down. The sixth and seventh targets were the most dangerous phase of the operation for a reason that had nothing to do with their individual capability and everything to do with simple mathematics. 5 of their colleagues had been eliminated over the course of approximately 90 minutes. They had not detected the cause. But 2 trained men in the dark, aware that something was wrong even if they didn't know what, aware that their team had gone silent in ways that were not operationally explained, would be running elevated alert states. Their patterns would be less predictable. Their observation would be more active. The margin for error was effectively zero. Dana took 40 minutes before engaging either of them. She spent that time doing nothing but watching and thinking, lying in the cold Afghan darkness with the mountain wind moving over her, and the distant sounds of ramparts position occasionally audible when the wind shifted, a voice, a movement, the sounds of people who were alive and waiting and trusting that someone outside was doing what needed to be done. She thought about Marco during those 40 minutes. She thought about him the way she always thought about him in the field, not with grief exactly. Grief was a thing she'd processed and integrated and made part of herself rather than a wound that was still open, but with the specific attention she paid to the lesson his death had taught her. The lesson was about assumptions, about the particular danger of believing you understood a situation completely, of letting your model of the threat environment become fixed rather than continuously updated. She checked her model against what she could observe. She looked for anything she might have assumed that wasn't verified. She found one thing. She had assumed the sixth and seventh targets were not in communication with each other beyond standard radio check-ins. But watching them now, she noticed a pattern, a small light signal, barely perceptible, moving between their positions every 7 minutes with the regularity of something agreed upon rather than coincidental. They were running their own check-in protocol. Visual, not radio, which meant it was invisible to Rampart's radio monitoring. And it meant that if she took the sixth target and the seventh didn't receive the expected signal at the 7-minute mark, the alarm would go up. She needed to take them within 7 minutes of each other. The sixth was at 430 meters. The seventh was at 610 meters, in a different direction, requiring her to reposition between shots. The repositioning distance was approximately 120 meters of terrain that she had not previously crossed and could not fully assess from her current position. She had 7 minutes. She made the calculation with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, not rushed, not panicked, simply clear. Clear about what was possible and what wasn't, clear about the variables she controlled and the ones she didn't, clear about the cost of being wrong. Then she fired at the sixth target, confirmed the hit and moved. 120 meters in the dark, on ground she hadn't assessed, in under 7 minutes. She moved at the fastest pace she could manage while maintaining the kind of noise discipline that the situation required, not sprinting, not crawling, but something between them, a controlled fast movement that covered ground while producing minimal sound signature, reading the terrain 2 steps ahead, placing her feet with the care of someone who understood that a loose rock in the wrong moment would cost more than the seconds saved by moving quickly. She reached her firing position for the 7th target with 90 seconds remaining in her window. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her heart rate was elevated from the movement and the calculation of the timeline and the accumulated stress of 3 hours of sustained precision work in the dark. She spent 45 seconds doing nothing but controlling her breathing, bringing her heart rate down, resettling her body into the stillness that the shot required. 45 seconds left in the window. She acquired the target, 610 meters, wind reading consistent with her earlier calculations, target stationary, clear shot to center mass. She fired. For 3 seconds she watched through her scope, waiting for movement, waiting for the target to shift or react or do anything other than what a man who had just been hit in the center of his chest did. He did that. 7 down. She lay still for 2 minutes, listening to the valley, reading the silence, confirming that no alarm had been raised, that the removal of 7 skilled men from the positions they'd held had gone undetected by the forces who had put them there. The valley was quiet in the way that valleys are quiet when the thing that was making them dangerous has been removed. She keyed her radio. Rampart, this is Graves. 7 clear. Your extraction routes are open. I'd recommend the northern corridor. It's the most direct to your pickup and I've confirmed it's clean to 400 meters. A pause. Then Prescott's voice, and in it, beneath the professional control, something that she recognized as relief of the specific and profound kind that comes when a situation that was going one way has been redirected. Copy 7 clear, Graves. Outstanding work. Another pause shorter. How many of you are out there? She was already moving east toward her extraction point, her rifle in her hands, her body settling back into the movement patterns of someone who had finished the hardest part of the night and now simply needed to cover 2 kilometers in the dark. Just me, she said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she thought the transmission had dropped. Then Prescott said, with the particular economy of someone who has run out of adequate language, "Understood. Rampart is moving. Good hunting, Graves." She clicked her radio twice in acknowledgement and kept moving. The 2 kilometers to her extraction point took her 38 minutes, through terrain that was demanding but no longer threatening, through the cold Afghan night that was beginning to show the first suggestion of a change in the darkness at its eastern edge. Not light yet, but the absence of the deepest dark, the sky beginning to consider the possibility of morning. She reached the extraction point at 3:47 hours. The vehicle was there, a battered Land Cruiser with a specialist named Owens behind the wheel who looked at her as she climbed in and said nothing, which she appreciated, and then drove south toward Asadabad without being asked. She sat in the passenger seat with her rifle across her knees and watched the valley pass outside the window, the mountains becoming slightly more visible as the sky continued its slow negotiation with the coming dawn. She thought about the 7 positions she'd worked through tonight, about the geometry and the patience, and the 45 seconds of breathing that had preceded the final shot. She thought about the check-in signal she'd identified, the small light moving between 2 positions in the dark, the detail that had changed her entire approach to the final phase. She thought about Marco because she always thought about Marco, and because tonight the lesson his death had taught her, stay current, verify your assumptions, never let your model become fixed, had been the lesson that mattered most. At FOB Asadabad, Captain Hollister was waiting in the operations center with the specific expression of someone who has been watching a radio for several hours and has had a lot of time to think about outcomes. He looked at Dana when she came through the door, read whatever her face communicated, and said, "All 7. All 7, she confirmed. He absorbed this. Rampart extracted clean. HVT is in custody. 2 wounded are en route to Bagram, both stable." He paused. "You want to tell me how you took 7 prepared snipers in 3 hours without a single one of them knowing what was happening?" Dana set her rifle down on the table and began her post-mission breakdown, checking the weapon with the same methodical care she applied to everything. "I watched them first," she said, "long enough to understand the system. Then I took them in the order that gave me the best chance of each shot going undetected by the ones who were left." That's the methodology, Hollister said. I'm asking how. She looked up from the rifle. Outside the plywood walls of the operations center, the fob was coming to life with the sounds of a base entering its morning cycle, generators and vehicles and voices, the machinery of a place that did not sleep exactly but had rhythms of its own. Patience, she said, mostly patience. Hollister looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, with the nod of someone who recognizes that they have received the complete answer, that there is no additional layer of explanation that would make it more comprehensible, that some things are simply what they are and require no further translation. Get some sleep, Graves, he said. She picked up her rifle and walked to her bunk and sat on the edge of it in the gray early light coming through the small window, and she cleaned the weapon one more time, because that was what she did, because that was the ritual that marked the end of one thing and the beginning of whatever came next. Her hands moved with the automatic precision of 8 years of practice, and her mind was quiet in the way it was only ever quiet after the work was finished, and the people she'd been responsible for were safe. 7 targets, 3 hours, 1 rifle. No one knew she'd been there until it was over. She laid the rifle down beside her on the bunk and closed her eyes. In the Kunar Valley, 60 kilometers north, Rampart was in the air, heading south, their HVT secured, their wounded stable, alive in the specific and non-negotiable way that was the only outcome Dana Graves had ever been willing to accept. She slept. Word count. Approximately 12,400 words, you said. She rolled up her sleeve. The general saw it and dropped his radio. She rolled up her sleeve. The general saw it and dropped his radio. 1:07 a.m. Claude responded. The morning they pulled Captain Renee Salazar out of the classified briefing and told her she was being reassigned. She was 3 weeks from the end of her fin. The morning they pulled Captain Renee Salazar out of the classified briefing and told her she was being reassigned. She was 3 weeks from the end of her final deployment and already mentally halfway home. She had been sitting in a folding chair in the operations center at Fob Lightning in Paktika Province, Afghanistan, listening to an intelligence officer describe the movement patterns of a mid-level Taliban commander with the particular monotone of someone who had given this briefing 11 times and had stopped caring whether the people receiving it were absorbing the information or quietly planning their post-deployment vacation. Renee had been absorbing it because absorbing information was what she did, had always done, had done since she was a child in Laredo, Texas, sitting in the back row of classrooms that were underfunded and overcrowded and taught by teachers who were overworked and underpaid, and who Renee had decided, at approximately age 9, she was going to learn from anyway because the alternative was not learning, and that was not an alternative she was willing to accept. The door opened, and a sergeant appeared and said Captain Salazar was needed immediately in the commander's office, and Renee had stood up and followed him with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned over 12 years of service, that the sentences that preceded you being needed immediately in the commander's office existed on a spectrum that ran from routine, administrative, to the kind of thing that changed everything, and you did not know which end of the spectrum you were on until you arrived. She arrived. Colonel Marcus Dean was standing behind his desk rather than sitting, which she noted because Dean was a man who used the geography of rooms deliberately, who stood when he wanted to communicate urgency and sat when he wanted to communicate control, and standing meant this was urgent. He was 53 years old, a career officer whose file she had not read but whose reputation she knew, steady, demanding, the kind of commander who asked hard questions and expected honest answers and returned honesty with the kind of trust that was worth having. Beside him stood a man she did not recognize, in civilian clothes that did not sit naturally on his frame, the way civilian clothes never quite sit naturally on people who have spent enough years in uniform that the uniform has become the baseline. He was approximately 45, lean and watchful, with the specific quality of stillness that she associated with intelligence professionals. Not relaxed, not tense, but calibrated, present in a way that suggested constant processing of the environment. "Captain Salazar," Dean said, "close the door." She closed it. "This is Mr. Farrell," Dean said, gesturing to the civilian without elaborating on what Mr. Farrell did or why Mr. Farrell was standing in a FOB commander's office in Paktika province at 7 in the morning. "He has a situation that requires your specific background." Renee looked at Farrell. Farrell looked at her with the evaluating quality of someone running a calculation. "You speak Dari, Pashto, and Arabic," Farrell said. It was not a question. "Fluently," she said. "You spent 14 months in Kandahar province on your first deployment working human intelligence coordination." "Correct." "You have a scar on your left forearm from a shrapnel wound, sustained during a vehicle ambush in Helmand province in 2019. She waited. That detail had not come from her official file, which listed the wound but not its location with that specificity. Farrell had done research that went beyond the official record, which told her something about who he was and what kind of operation he was running. "I have a scar," she confirmed. Farrell looked at Dean. Something passed between them that was not language but was communication, the compressed exchange of two people who had already discussed this at length and had arrived at a decision that this meeting was confirming rather than making. "Sit down, Captain," Dean said. "What I'm about to tell you is classified above your current clearance level. As of this moment, your clearance has been temporarily elevated. What you hear in this room does not leave it except through channels Mr. Farrell will specify." Renee sat. She put her hands on her knees and her face in neutral, and she listened. The situation was this. For 11 months, a woman named Amara Haydari had been operating as a deep-cover asset inside the network of a Taliban commander named General Hamid Wazir, a man whose nominal rank was a self-designation that nevertheless accurately described his organizational authority. He commanded approximately 1,200 fighters across 4 provinces, controlled supply networks that fed 3 separate insurgent operations, and had been personally responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed 31 American and NATO personnel in the past 18 months. Wazir was, in the assessment of every intelligence analyst who had studied his operation, the most significant Taliban commander currently active in eastern Afghanistan, and the primary obstacle to the stability of 3 provincial governments that were otherwise making genuine progress. Amara Haydari had spent 11 months earning his trust. She had done this through a combination of genuine linguistic and cultural sophistication, a cover identity that had been constructed over 2 years before her insertion, and was consequently deep and verifiable, and a personal courage that Farrell described in the specific understated language of intelligence professionals who dealt in human courage as a commodity and had learned to assess it with precision. She had provided actionable intelligence on 4 separate occasions that had resulted in successful interdiction operations. She had survived 2 internal security sweeps of Wazir's organization that had identified and executed 3 other suspected informants. She had moved from the outer ring of the network to a position of genuine proximity to Wazir's inner circle. 3 days ago, she had transmitted a message through her dead drop protocol, indicating that Wazir was planning a major operation, target unspecified in the transmission, but assessed as high-value American or NATO personnel, scheduled for execution within 72 hours. She had indicated she had specific details on the target and timing, but that transmission through the dead drop was not secure enough for that level of information. She needed a direct meeting with an American handler. The problem was that Amara Haydari's cover specified that she was a woman who had grown up in a specific village in Lagar province, who had specific family connections in that region, and who had specific cultural restrictions on her interaction with men outside her family. Any meeting with a male American handler was not only logistically complicated, but cover-threatening in ways that could get her killed within hours of the meeting occurring. The meeting needed to be with a woman, an American woman who could pass, at least peripherally and briefly, in the cultural context of Lagar province, who spoke Dari fluently enough to conduct a sensitive conversation without a translator present, who had enough intelligence background to extract maximum information from a source who might have limited time and limited ability to speak freely, and who had, for reasons that Farrell explained with the care of someone, revealing the precise detail that made an operation either possible or impossible, a visible scar on her left forearm. Amara had built her cover around a story that included a childhood friend, a woman she had grown up with, who had left the village years ago, who had a specific scar from a specific childhood accident that Amara had described in detail to members of Wazir's network as part of the natural human texture of her backstory. The childhood friend with the scar was a fiction that Amara had created, a thread in the tapestry of her false identity, and she had now used that fiction as the authentication protocol for this meeting. The person who came to meet her needed to be a woman, needed to speak Dari, and needed to have a visible scar on her left forearm. Otherwise, Amara would not speak. And if Amara did not speak, the operation she had spent 11 months building toward would die with it, and the 37 American and NATO personnel that Wazir's planned operation was assessed as targeting would have no warning. Renee sat with this information for 30 seconds. She looked at the scar on her left forearm, a 6-inch line of slightly raised, slightly discolored skin that she had stopped noticing approximately 2 years after it was created, and that had now, improbably and completely, become operationally significant. She asked 4 questions. What was the meeting location and how would she reach it? What was her cover identity for the approach? What extraction protocol existed if the meeting was compromised? And what was the timeline? Farrell answered the first 3 directly. The meeting location was a village in Lagar province, accessible by a route that his team had surveyed and assessed as viable. Her cover for the approach was a modified version of her actual identity, an Afghan-American woman visiting family connections in the region, plausible given her fluency and her physical appearance, which was dark-haired and olive-skinned in a way that did not immediately read as American to a casual observer. Extraction was a vehicle team, positioned 2 kilometers from the village that would move on her signal. The timeline was the problem. The 72-hour window, Renee said. Opened 36 hours ago, Farrell confirmed. You have 36 hours remaining before the operation executes, assuming Wazir's timeline is accurate. The meeting needs to happen in the next 4 hours or the intelligence will be operationally useless even if we get it. 4 hours. To prepare for a deep cover meeting with a source inside one of the most dangerous Taliban networks in eastern Afghanistan, operating under a cover identity she had not built herself, in a village she had never visited, to extract intelligence that 37 people's lives depended on. She looked at Dean. "Your call, Captain," Dean said, and in his voice was the precise weight of a commander who was giving an officer a genuine choice, while being fully aware that the officer in front of him was not the kind of person who chose the door that led away from the 37. She stood up. "I need 90 minutes with Farrell on the cover identity and the source profile," she said. "Then I need 30 minutes alone. Then I'm ready." She spent the 90 minutes the way she spent every preparation phase, comprehensively and without rushing, which were not contradictions but complements. The way thoroughness and efficiency were complements when you understood that the time spent preparing was always cheaper than the time spent managing the consequences of inadequate preparation. Farrell was good. He gave her Amara Haydari's file with the precision of someone who had built the asset and knew every detail from the inside, and he answered her questions about the source's psychology and her patterns and her communication style with the intimacy of a handler who had spent 11 months in indirect relationship with a person whose life depended on his judgment. He told her things that were not in the file. The way Amara signaled that she was speaking freely versus the way she signaled that she was speaking under observation. The phrases she used when she was certain versus when she was uncertain. The particular quality of her written communications when she was afraid. Renee absorbed everything. The 30 minutes alone she spent in her bunk, lying on her back, staring at the ceiling, running through the meeting in her mind. Not scripting it. Scripted conversations in intelligence contexts were fragile, prone to breaking down at the first unexpected variable. Instead, she was building a model of Amara Haydari from everything Farrell had given her. A model complete enough that she could respond to whatever the actual Amara presented without hesitation, without the fraction of a second processing delay that a source as experienced and careful as Amara would detect and interpret as inauthenticity. She thought about the scar, about the improbability of it, that a piece of shrapnel in a Helmand Province ambush in 2019 had produced a wound that had healed into a 6-inch line of raised tissue that had now become the authentication for an intelligence meeting that 37 lives depended on. She turned it over in her mind the way you turned over improbabilities, looking for the lesson in it. The lesson was something she already knew but kept finding demonstrated in new ways. Preparation was what you did deliberately, but readiness was the accumulation of everything that had happened to you, including the things that had happened to you without your planning for them. She had not planned the shrapnel. She had not planned the scar. She could not have known that they would matter. They mattered. She got up, changed into the civilian clothes Farrell's team had prepared, and went to find her driver. The village was 40 kilometers from Fob Lightning, accessible by a route that varied between maintained road and barely maintained track, and at one point, for approximately 3 kilometers, something that a generous assessment would call a path and an honest assessment would call an intention. The driver was one of Farrell's people, a young woman named Chen who drove with the focused competence of someone who had done this exact kind of approach route many times, and had developed the specific skill of moving quickly through difficult terrain, while appearing to move at the pace of someone who had no particular urgency and no particular purpose. They reached the village at 10:34 hours. Renee got out of the vehicle with the unhurried motion of someone arriving at a place she had arrived at before, carrying a bag that contained items consistent with her cover and nothing else, because anything else was a complication she didn't need. Chen drove away without looking back. The village was small, 40 or 50 compounds, a mosque, a market that was active in the morning hours with the specific domestic commerce of a place where people were living their lives with as much normalcy as the surrounding context allowed. Women in the market, children moving between compounds, men sitting in the shade of a wall talking with the deliberate leisure of men who had learned that urgency was a thing that attracted attention. Renee moved through it the way she moved through all environments, with observation that looked like ordinary awareness, with attention that presented as casual interest, reading the space for the information it contained while giving nothing back that wasn't consistent with her cover. She found the compound Farrell had described. Third from the northern wall, blue door, a crack in the upper right corner of the door frame that looked accidental and was not. She knocked in the pattern she'd been given 3, pause, 2, and waited. The woman who opened the door was approximately 35, with dark eyes that processed Renee's face in approximately half a second, with the rapid comprehensive assessment of someone whose survival had depended for 11 months on reading people correctly and quickly. She was not what Renee had expected, which was not a useful expectation to have had. Renee noted this and filed it. Amara Haydari was smaller than her photograph suggested, and her stillness was different from the calibrated stillness of intelligence professionals. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to be still, because stillness was the thing that had kept her alive, and it had become so deep and so habitual that it was now simply who she was. She looked at Renee's face. Then her eyes moved to Renee's left forearm, where the sleeve of her clothing had ridden up slightly, exposing the lower part of the scar. Renee rolled up her sleeve. The scar was fully visible. 6 inches, raised, the particular texture of healed shrapnel damage, exactly as Amara had described her fictional childhood friend's wound to Wazir's people over 11 months of carefully constructed false memory. Amara looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at Renee's face again, and something in her expression shifted, not relaxed, not relieved, because those were luxuries she had stopped allowing herself approximately 8 months into this operation. But a fractional opening, a microscopic adjustment in the quality of her stillness that Renee recognized, from everything Farrell had told her, as the signal that meant she was willing to speak. "Come in," Amara said in Dari, quickly. The compound's interior was neat and spare, the domestic arrangement of someone who lived with conscious minimalism, either by necessity or by choice, or by the instinct of someone who had learned that attachment to objects was a vulnerability. Amara led her to a back room, away from the windows, and sat across from her on a cushion on the floor with the direct eye contact of someone who had no interest in preamble. "I have 40 minutes, Amara said. Still in Dari, her accent the specific regional inflection of Lagar province that Renee's ear confirmed matched the profile she'd been given. Possibly less. "I understand," Renee said in Dari. "Tell me what you have." What Amara had was devastating in its specificity. The operation Wazir was planning was not, as the intelligence analysts had assessed, a strike on American or NATO military personnel. The target was a meeting, a provincial peace council convening in 31 hours in the city of Gardez, attended by the governors of 3 provinces, 4 NATO civilian advisors, 2 American State Department officials, and approximately 60 local leaders, elders, and civil society representatives, who represented the most significant concentration of pro-stability figures in eastern Afghanistan. Wazir's plan was a complex attack, simultaneous vehicle-borne IEDs at the 2 main entrances to the council venue, followed by a ground assault by fighters already positioned inside the city, timed to coincide with the moment the delegates were arriving and therefore at maximum vulnerability. The intelligence assessment of casualties if the operation executed successfully was not 37. It was significantly higher. Amara gave her the vehicle staging locations, the fighter positions, the timing sequence, the communication protocols Wazir's network would use to coordinate the attack, and the identity of the internal contact inside the council venue's security arrangements who had facilitated access for Wazir's prepositioned fighters. She gave all of this in 31 minutes, in the compressed precise language of someone who had spent 11 months cataloging details for exactly this moment. In a room in a village in Lagar province with a woman she had never met whose only credential was a scar on her left forearm, and the ability to receive information in Dari without a translator standing between them. At the 31-minute mark, Amara stopped talking. She looked at Renee with those dark eyes that had been reading people for 11 months in an environment where misreading them meant death. "Is it enough?" she asked. "It's enough," Renee said. Amara nodded. A small motion, economical, the nod of someone who has done what she came to do and is now calculating the next step in her own survival. "You need to leave first," Amara said. "I'll give you 5 minutes and then I'll go back to the market. If anyone asks, you were an old acquaintance passing through." "Understood." Renee stood, smoothing her clothing, shifting her bag to the appropriate position for her cover. She looked at Amara, at this woman who had spent 11 months in the interior of something that would have destroyed most people, who had produced intelligence that was about to save dozens of lives, who would now go back to that interior and continue, because the operation was not yet complete, and she was not the kind of person who left things incomplete. "Is there anything you need?" Renee asked. Amara considered this with the seriousness of someone who knew exactly what it meant to need things in her situation. Just go, she said, and use it. Renee went. She was 200 meters from the compound when her phone, set to silent, vibrated with the check-in signal from Chen. She sent the return signal, all clear, moving to extraction, and kept walking through the village market with the unhurried purpose of someone leaving a place they had always intended to leave. Chen picked her up at the edge of the village and drove south without speaking, which was correct, because Renee was already composing the transmission in her head. The structure of it, the sequence of the intelligence, the way to present Amara's information so that it could be acted on immediately by the people who needed to act on it. She transmitted from the vehicle, using Farrell's encrypted system, 17 minutes into the drive south. The transmission was comprehensive, detailed, and structured for operational use. She gave Amara's intelligence exactly as Amara had given it, with precision and without editorializing, because the intelligence was complete and her job was transmission, not interpretation. Fob Lightning's operations center was active when she arrived, which told her the transmission had been received and was being processed. Farrell was at a workstation, his civilian composure showing the edges of something more urgent underneath it, his phone in one hand and a tablet in the other. He looked up when she came through the door, and his expression confirmed what she already knew. "We have it," he said. "Garda's security forces have been notified. NATO is moving. The internal contact has been identified and is being detained." He paused, running the calculation visible on his face. "If the timeline holds, we have enough to disrupt the operation completely." Renee set her bag down. "Amara's position?" "Unchanged for now. We're monitoring. If there's any indication of compromise, we'll initiate extraction protocol." Farrell looked at her steadily. "She's been in harder situations than this." "I know," Renee said. She meant it as an acknowledgement. She also meant it as something else, as the recognition of a kind of courage that operated in a register she understood, but had not previously witnessed at this proximity. The courage that was not the acute courage of combat, the immediate response to immediate threat that adrenaline and training could produce in many people. The courage that was chronic daily, sustained over 11 months in an environment that was continuously threatening, that required every day the same decision to continue that the first day had required. Colonel Dean found her 20 minutes later in the operations center, reading the response traffic from Gardes. He stood beside her and read with her for a moment, and then he said, without preamble, "The council meeting proceeds as scheduled with enhanced security. Wazir's vehicle teams have been located and are being watched. We have everything." "Good," Renee said. "You want to tell me how it went?" She thought about the compound, the back room, the 31 minutes, the woman with the dark eyes who had given her everything she had in the precise and economical way of someone who understood the value of what she was giving. She thought about rolling up her sleeve, about the scar that had been a wound, that had been an ambush, that had been a moment of violence in a Helmand Province road in 2019, and the improbable chain of contingency that had led from that moment to this one. She was ready, Renee said. She had everything prepared. She just needed someone to give it to. Dean nodded. He looked at her left forearm where the sleeve had ridden up slightly, the scar visible. "Hell of a thing," he said quietly. "That scar." "Yes," Renee said, "it is." She rolled her sleeve down and went back to reading the traffic from Gardes, where security forces were moving into position around a council venue, where 60-odd people were going to convene tomorrow morning and discuss the future of their provinces and drink tea and argue about governance and go home to their families, none of them knowing how close the morning had come to being something else entirely. None of them knowing about a room in a village in Lager province, and a woman with dark eyes, and a woman with a scar, and 31 minutes in which everything that mattered had been said. Outside Fob Lightning, The Afghan afternoon was doing what Afghan afternoons did, the light changing on the mountains, the dust rising from the road where a vehicle was moving, the sky beginning its slow shift toward the particular colors it made over this landscape at this time of day. Colors that Renee had stopped finding beautiful somewhere around her second deployment, and had started finding beautiful again somewhere around her third, which she had decided was either personal growth or institutional damage, and she had not yet determined which. She finished reading the traffic. She closed the tablet. She thought about Lily, which was wrong. Lily was someone else's daughter, someone from a different story, a name that had no place in her mind. She thought about Laredo, about the back row of the classroom, about the teacher who was overworked and underpaid, and from whom she had decided at age 9 she was going to learn anyway. She thought about the 37, about the 60, about the people in Gardes who would wake up tomorrow and go to a meeting and not know. She thought about Amara Haydari, who was in a village in Lagar province right now, going back to the market, reconstructing her stillness, continuing. Renee Salazar picked up her bag and walked to her bunk and sat down on the edge of it, and she pushed up her left sleeve and looked at the scar for a long time. 6 inches, raised, healed. Useful it turned out. She rolled her sleeve back down and lay back and stared at the ceiling and let the operation center sounds move around her, the noise of a place that was doing the work that places like this did. And she stayed there until the sounds faded into the background, and the background faded into something quieter, and the quiet became the particular quality of stillness that preceded sleep. She slept. In Gardes, 31 hours later, 60 people sat in a room and talked about the future.